So hi everybody. Thank you all for coming to this, I think, 24th Grassy Plains Network talk on all things grassy. And my name, we haven't met before, is Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network, and these days we are part of the Victorian National Parks Association. Before I introduce Emma, I'll just say that I'd like to acknowledge the people, especially of the First Nations people, especially of the Kulin Nation, who have looked after the grasslands in and around Melbourne or Naarm for so long, and are doing so much now to repair the terrible damage that we colonialists have inflicted upon the land. But I'd like also to extend that acknowledgement to the First Nations people of all the grassy areas of Victoria, of which, you know, to the north and the west, and also to the east, of course, and to the south, and the watery bits, for that matter, for heaven's sake. So without further ado, I'll introduce Emma Bennett. Emma is the Principal Ecologist at have I got that right? Elmoby Ecology. She is a self-confessed batavist. She has her doctorate from Monash University. She has over 20 years experience doing all things bat and wind energy related, and she's also, surprisingly, an expert in detection dogs. She works a lot with First Nations people on Sky Country as well. And I'm sure, Emma, you can fill in all the blanks that I have left. And if you have questions for Emma as the talk goes through, please pop them in the chat, or probably feel free to shout them out and interrupt her. I'm sure she'll rise to the occasion and enjoy not speaking out into the void. So Emma, thank you very much for coming along today. It's great to have you here, and over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. I do have to have a confession. I feel a bit like a pseudo bat ecologist, and I noticed that Chris Coburn's in the room. So Chris, shout out or comment if I make a mistake, please. And I wasn't really sure what the sort of breadth of experience here is. So I will do an overview on bats in general before I focus on what I've been working on for the last 20 years. And I'll share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see that? Great. So as Adrian said, my name is Emma Bennett. I've been working on wind and wildlife issues for around about 20 years, and I have unintentionally become a bativist. I started finding a lot of dead bats in my early career as a detection dog handler, and that has led me into this career now to save the bats. But first I'd like to acknowledge the deep and continued connection of the Kulin Nation, not just to the land and the water, but also to Sky Country, which is a new conversation that we're all starting to have around protecting our birds and bats. And so under their care, bats were thriving. And this is Balayang. So Balayang is the brother to Bunjil. Bunjil is the creator for our Kulin Nation, the wedge-tailed eagle, and he created Balayang, his brother. In turn, Balayang is known as the creator of women. So I have a lot of respect for Balayang as the creator of women, and also it's got very important in the cultural stories, particularly across these Western grasslands where we're talking about and under the Kulin Nation. So let's get batty. So bats make up about 20% of all the mammals on Earth, which is quite a lot. So they're second only to rodents. There are about 1,400 species worldwide, and we have around about 90 of them in Australia. And this is a little photo of my favourite bat, which I will talk more about later, but this is the white-striped free-tail bat, which is very much a big part of your grassy plains. it's definitely probably one of the key species in the areas you're thinking about. So we'll just go through some bat facts. Bats are the only mammals capable of true flight. And I love putting up a picture of a bat skeleton because it does look like a very weird little human. So the wings are just simply the fingers. So all of the other parts you can see are there, and it's particularly interesting, this sort of square-legged. But if you look at the picture in the corner, the wings actually connect from down towards the ankles and right up through all of those fingers. And that's what gives them really good dexterity in their flights. They're much more capable flyers than birds. They're able to navigate and move around in a much more sophisticated way in the way that they fly. And the important thing is bats are everywhere. A lot of people don't realize this, but bats are absolutely everywhere. They're in the city, they're in the forests, they're in your grasslands, they're in the mountains, in the cold, and they're over rivers, and they're everywhere. And yeah, love this photo because in New South Wales, there's a lot of work now with bridge redevelopment because bats love bridges, and it's a really important habitat for them, particularly in with some threatened species in New South Wales. Bats are also very misunderstood. And I think this probably comes back, it always seems to be related back to the vampire bats, which genuinely do feed on the blood of other animals. So they'll come down, land on an animal, feed their blood, and then take off again. And they are one of the few bats that can take off from the ground. Most bats need to fall before they fly. So they will climb, if they find themselves on the ground, they will walk to a tree, climb a tree, and then fall to get that flight. But vampire bats can just come in, drink the blood, and take off. But they're found in Central and South America, not Australia. We have what's called a false vampire bat, which is the ghost bat, which is one of our largest echolocating bats. And it does feed on lizards and birds and rodents and even other smaller bats. And their range is really restricted. They're one of our listed bat species, and we have a lot of bats that are listed as sort of vulnerable or threatened, and the ghost bat is one of them. Really interesting for a lot of scientists at the moment is bats do hold the secret to long life. So for their size, they are an extremely long-lived animal. And I think out of the top 14 animals based on their size and longevity, bats make up 13 of them. So they carry all kinds of diseases, but they rarely actually get sick. And it's something to do with their chromosomes. So the end caps on their chromosomes are much better at resisting change and degradation, including things like cancers and viruses. So there's lots of research here that there's a lot of scientists going in looking at why bats can actually live longer and why their cells don't degrade at the same rate. And when I mean live longer, we're talking about a little tiny bat that's the size of a mouse might live for 20 or 30 years, whereas mice would only live for a couple of years. So it's a real difference in that longevity. Bats are very social. We see that with our flying foxes and our cave-dwelling bats. But they often, even small bats and bats that don't live in such large clusters, can be really social, and they live in family groups. They'll often come together. The females will come together to have their pups and will create these sort of maternity nurseries where they look after each other's pups as well. And this can include things like sharing food and tending the sick. And there is an Egyptian bat that when they do get sick, they will self-isolate and move away from the colony to reduce infection on other members. And this is just a photo of some of their young, just to see how vulnerable they are and how much care they will need. You can see these big sort of groups. There is a lot more babies than there are mothers in that photo, and they are particularly dependent on their parents, drinking milk like all mammals. And I don't know how they come in and find their pups, but they'll come in and find their pups in a colony of millions, which is, I think, an excellent feat. And so importantly for groups like this, bats provide key ecosystem services. For example, in terms of their pesticide management, in the US, it's estimated that somewhere between 3.7 billion and $53 billion worth of pest control. Now, whether it's at the lower end or the higher end, they're big numbers. And bats can eat around 50 to 70% of their body weight every night, and they are key pollinators and seed dispersers. So there was recently an incident in the United States where populations crashed for particular species, and the increased cost and use of pesticide was measurable in farms in the area, which in turn has led to increases in child mortality. So the services that bats are providing can have far-reaching consequences. And I love this little story about durian. There's a lot of work happening in Indonesia at the moment because no bats means no durians. And they are a key food and staple item for the people there. And bats have traditionally been persecuted and hunted and not liked in that area. So there's a lot of positive publicity that's trying to come out, teaching people about the importance of bats, particularly for not just seed dispersal, but for pollination as well. So now I'm going to come back to Australia and talk about some of the bats that we have here. So there's two sort of distinct group of bats that we talk about. There's those from the Pteropodidae order and all the other ones. So these guys include our flying foxes. And they separated from the other bats more than 28 million years ago, which is a really long time in evolution. So really quite a different a lineage of bats. They don't have any echolocation. There's about 200 species worldwide. You can see by the map at the bottom, they're really restricted to this, sort of south of the Sahara, south of the cold mountain ranges through Nepal, and across the islands in Southeast Asia. So we have this sort of limiting factor. And I know a lot of Australians, when we talk about bats when I'm overseas in other countries, they don't think about flying foxes. But for most Australians, that's sort of the first bat that we all think about because it's big and easy to see. But it's not just flying foxes that we have in Australia. This is the eastern tube-nosed bat. This is part of that family as well. And what's different about these guys is because they're not echolocating, they'll always have really big eyes, which is what makes them adorable. And so they use... Sorry, does someone have a question? Or... and so with this one, the eastern tube-nosed bat, the tube nose on its face there is thought to actually help it to breathe while it's feeding on nectar and pollen. And so this is probably the one we're most familiar with in Victoria. This is the grey-headed flying fox. It's listed as vulnerable under the EPBC Act. And it's also one of the most mobile mammals in the world, ranging from up in Queensland down across to Adelaide now. And it can move, it can fly at sort of 40, 50 kilometres an hour. And it can travel really big distances. And it's really important for helping maintain genetic diversity in the plants that it feeds from. And one of the ways it does that is through this long distance dispersal. It is collecting pollen from 50 kilometres away and sharing it with pollen that might be 50 or 100 kilometres away. And so you get that really good mix of genetic diversity that's helped by these long distance dispersers. Now, flying foxes are part of what's called the Old World fruit bats. And this is the most at-risk group of bats that we have. And so this paper, which came out by Tigger Kinston a few years ago, it shows on the graph, you can see in the different colours there, the large Old World fruit bats, which is what that acronym is for. Then there are the other members of the Pteropodidae family and sort of other bats. And you can see that, most of them, more than about 80%, are listed as near threatened or worse. And that's across the board for these flying foxes. We have 4 species in Australia and 2 of them are listed. So that we're sitting at 50%, which is better than most people. And if you look at the graph with the orange and grey bars, you can see that hunting is actually the highest threat that this group of animals, which are all near threatened or worse, is actually getting. So there's a lot of community education and a lot of human wildlife conflict that is going on. And they've isolated persecution out of that. That's a sort of 15, you can see further along, persecution is a little bit lower on the percentage of species threatened. But obviously land use change and habitat change, climate change, urbanisation, which threatens many of our species, is having a bigger impact across all of these species. And up until 2012, or actually continued on past 2012, we actually had legislation in Australia for how we kill flying foxes, including 2 of our threatened listed species. So it's really only been in the past decade that even Australia has started to make peace with this species. So you can imagine that some of these other cultures which have traditionally hunted them for food or have seen them as pests is sort of really struggling to change the way people in the population see that. And there was a story from back in sort of 2020 where Mauritius actually culled, I think it was something like 30 or 40% of the entire population of an endangered bat that exists nowhere else. So this was only 4 or 5 years ago. So it really is, a plight of our old world fruit bats, and they are critical ecosystem ones. But let's bring it back to the grassy plains. Oh, hang on, I'll go through the rest of Australia's ones first. This is our little red. This is our most abundant of the large fruit bats that we have. I haven't seen them down in Victoria, but my map tells me they are, but you do see, these are the ones you see in big swarms over Queensland. When Queenslanders stand up and say, the bats are invading our town, it's typically this species. And we have 2 other ones. We have the black flying fox and the spectacled flying fox. I'll leave you to work out which is which. But the spectacled is endangered in Australia. And the black one I think is doing reasonably well across its range. Although don't quote me on that. Chris might have something else to say. And I always love to throw in this photo. This is the world's largest bat, the golden crowned flying fox. It's got a wingspan of 5'6". And obviously it's an Asian bat, which is why the person's quite short, 5'4". But it's massive. And this is one of those bats that it's from the Philippines and it is being very restricted in its range. It's still receiving hunting pressure. You can still buy this bat at markets for food. Okay, well, let's move on to our echolocating bats. So something a little bit smaller and a little bit more obscure. This is the smallest bat here in this image. Affectionately known as the bumblebee bat. It's tiny. So bats can live up to 40 years. These tiny little creatures living up to 40 years is a real anomaly in the animal kingdom. They generally only have 1 pup a year, and it generally takes a couple of years for them to reach sexual maturity, which means that they're really slow to recover from population declines. And they don't always have a pup every year. So they will stay sexually mature until they're 20 or 30, but they don't always have a pup every year. So when we see a crash in their population, it's a very, very slow recovery for these species. So here's some of the common bats, insectivorous bats we will see in Victoria. Our large forest bat, which is not much bigger than a 50-cent piece. Our little forest bat, which is quite a bit smaller than that. Our Gould's wattled bat. I always love the lesser long-eared bats because I'm not sure why it's lesser, because those ears are massive and they're very easy to identify. Now I'll go on to actually, I think we're going to talk about echolocating bats. So a bat call signature is one of the key identifying features, and it's the main way that we can survey for bats. Bats are incredibly hard to survey. Some bats avoid being caught in mist nets. Some bats simply fly higher than we're able to catch them. But we can record their unique echolocation signature that they put out. This is actually, because this is one of the better images online, this is actually bats from Central America. But you can see how when they're recording their sound waves, and you'll see a repeat pattern of these, you can start to identify, and this is a real skill. I think Chris is one of those people that's particularly good at this, I'm told. But this is a real skill for people to be able to identify these bats, and there's still a lot of unclassified bats. This image makes it look easy and that they're all quite separate, but you see a lot of overlap and you see a lot of noise when you're recording bats. So sometimes we can only say it's a group of bats rather than an individual species. So it's one of the challenges with bats in terms of quantifying how many are in the environment, how many are out there, and what areas they're using. And this is the best tool we currently have for doing that. So we can divide bats into feeding guilds, insectivorous, frugivores, nectivores, carnivores, piscivores, which there is only one species that eats fish, from my understanding. And of course, you've got those blood feeding and scavengers. But more interestingly for the Grassy Plains network is we can also divide them into foraging guilds. So this is where they prefer to feed. So you can see the open space foragers are the ones that you'll see over they will feed over the top of trees and over those grassy areas. So when places are clear, and I think the edge, the narrow space sort of speak for themselves, going in between the trees. And it also affects how their call signature works, because something that is feeding in a narrow space will have a lot of noise. If they're putting out an echolocating pulse, there's a lot of things for it to hit. So you get some really unique call patterns in that regard. It's also just a bit of a misconception. The narrow and edge space bats, they do actually fly in open space. They're just not feeding in there preferentially. So bats will fly to a particular feeding space from their where they're roosting overnight, and that will take them through lots of open space. And I'm mentioning that because I will talk about wind turbines later. So this is probably the best studied bat we have in Victoria. This is the southern bent-winged bat. And it primarily has maternity caves of near Warrnambool and over near Narracourt. And it's listed as critically endangered under the EPBC Act. It does overlap with the eastern bent-winged bat in terms of species identification, but it really has its own unique characteristics in terms of going back to the same maternity caves each year and breeding the same area. Now, these guys are open space feeders, foragers, and we do find them killed at wind farms. So probably the biggest threat to southern bent-winged bats, however, is white nose syndrome, which hasn't made its way to Australia yet. But where it has been found, it has had absolutely catastrophic impacts, particularly on the cave-dwelling bats. So over winter, bats go into, it's not a hibernation, it's called a torpor, which is like a hibernation, just not quite as deep. And what happens is with white nose syndrome is this fungus starts to grow on these sleeping bats. And it's uncomfortable and disruptive, and they wake. So they're constantly sort of waking and not getting their true torpor and effectively starving to death through their natural sort of torpor season. So in America, 90% of the populations for the northern long-eared, the little browns and the tricoloured bats were lost in a really short period of time. And that's where that research about increased pesticide use comes from and changes in crop production due to a loss of bats. 7 million bats is a lot, a lot of bats to die. And if it does come to Australia, it is our cave-dwelling bats that are most at risk, because that is where it feeds, and it's typically transported from cave to cave by people who are not following good hygiene. And so Australia is probably spending, up until a few months ago, spending more money on white nose syndrome for bats than most other things. And part of that is about raising the awareness of people that are entering caves and working in caves, because we do have this sort of tourism from around the world where somebody in a cave in America may then come and do caving in Australia and inadvertently bring this to our shores. And it is characterised by the white fungus growing on their nose. So it is a big issue. It's not here yet, but as we've seen with most invaders around the world, these things happen eventually over time. So now this brings me to my favourite bat, and probably one of the most important ones for these open grassy areas. This is the white-striped free-tail bat. It's one of the largest insectivorous bats in Victoria. You can see a little image there of it in comparison to a little forest bat. So we're looking at around 30 grams compared to 5 grams. They are like a very large mouse size with wings, and they're really easy to identify because they have this free tail sticking out past the wing membrane and these really white patches. Now, if you're standing outside in summer on a warm, still night and you start seeing bats fly over, you can actually get glimpses of this little white patch because it is a large bat. And the other thing that's really interesting about this bat is we can hear it. So all of the other bats in Victoria are outside our hearing. And hopefully if I play this, it will come over your speakers as well. Can you hear that little squeak? Oh. It's a little chirp, a little squeak. I'm sorry you can't hear that, because you will all recognize it. So I encourage you to go and Google a bat audio of this white-striped free-tail bat, because it is the easiest one to identify. It is the easiest one to stand out there on a summer's night and go, oh, I know what that is. That's this species. And you will find them everywhere. They're right up to Queensland, and you find them in Western Australia as well. They've recently been proven that they are in Tasmania. We've been recording them acoustically there for over 10 years, but unfortunately one has been found dead at a wind farm. So we have clear evidence that white-striped free-tail bats are in Tasmania as well. So they're all over Australia and potentially migrating. As with all bats, even though this is the easiest one to see, the easiest one to hear, we still know very little about it. Which brings me on to turbine collision. Bats are highly susceptible to turbine collision. So just in Victoria, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 bats are dying every year. And half of all of those impacts are white-striped free-tail bats. So turbines are getting taller and taller. So this means our open space foragers and those bats that are commuting between feeding spaces and roosting sites are going to have a higher impact. So the blades are getting further down to the ground and they're going higher up into the sky. So we're looking at about 280 metres for tip height, going down to almost sort of 40 metres above the ground or 60 metres above the ground where they're pushing them up. A lot of wind farm companies are moving to that 60 metres and implying that it will reduce the risk to bats, but there doesn't appear to be any good evidence to support that. So turbines are getting bigger, that rotor area is getting bigger, which means more bats per turbine are going to be impacted in the future. Probably a similar amount for energy production, but what will change is we will see even more white-striped free-tail bats impacted because they are part of that high-flying group. Now, bats are only at risk at low wind speed. So what this graph is showing is the wind energy generation on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we've got wind speed. Now, the blue line represents when turbines start spinning, and the red line represents when bats stop flying or thereabouts. So in that red shaded area is where we have the collision risk. Because the bats are not flying when it's windy, because they're quite small, so they tend to fly at the lower wind speeds, and energy generation is not great at the low wind speeds. Obviously, the more wind blows, the more energy you make. So there's this risk period. And as we mentioned earlier, bats go into a bit of a torpor over winter. So we also just have a time of year when this is at risk as well. So one of the things that I've been working on as part of my career is to try and get operational changes to wind turbines. And I'll come back to that. Here is a list of all of the species sort of in Western Victoria. Here is a list of all of the species in Western Victoria that I have found dead at a wind farm. So what we're seeing is, even though wind turbines are built in those open areas where you would expect to see those open air forages, one thing you can see on here, you can see the forest bats. All of the forest bats are on here, and they make up somewhere between 10 and 20%, the three species, of all the bats that we find. So you can see that the southern bent-winged bat and the eastern bent-winged bat, both listed species, are on this, and undescribed species. Now, I think the only reason we haven't found the yellow-bellied sheath-tail bat is because we haven't built where that is yet. And that's probably a similar story for the inland broad-nosed bat. The large-footed myotis is unlikely to be impacted because it feeds over water, so it does keep low to the ground, and trails its feet on the water and picks insects up off the top. So I would suggest moving forward, as we expand our wind energy and do better surveys, it's only the myotis that's going to stay off this list. So this is what I have been working on for the past decade, and this came about because I had picked up too many dead bats with my dog during these surveys under wind turbines. So there's a couple of publications on the right there, which I've been involved in. Wind turbines kill bats, but they don't have to. And we have done a curtailment trial, which is changing the speed at which the turbine first starts spinning just between January and May. Now, we did a small operational change and reduced bat deaths by 50%. We can reduce bat deaths by over 90% with a slightly higher operational change. And you can see, even in America, this legacy of care was introduced almost 10 years ago now to help wind energy reduce their overall impacts on bats. And we do not have anything like that in Australia. More recently, this paper came out, which is a decade of curtailment studies, shows that it works. And what's really nice is this one study that we've done in Australia aligns really well with all of the Northern Hemisphere data. So we know it works, and we know it prevents bat deaths. What I say to everyone in this room, and what I always say when I get to this point, is if there is a wind farm being built, if you are consulting on any of this, ask for curtailment for bats. It costs the company that we did the trial on 0.09% of their annual revenue. So it is not a big cost to the company, but if they don't have to, they won't. So that wind turbines kill bats has come out through the Ecological Society of Australia as one of the hot topics. So there is a really nice glossy thing that can be given to MPs and decision makers, and there is a massive sort of reference list there as well with all the citations and all the information. I just wanted to also talk about the Australasian Bat Society, because they have a fantastic resource on their website where you can look at where you live and what bats you will find there. So they have beautiful bat maps with all their distributions, and you can go and find out what species you're likely to find wherever you are travelling. And that's a ghost bat in the picture there, because they are uniquely one of Australia's coolest looking bats, I think. not many are white. So I'm going to finish it by being a little bit batty and say support bat conservation, because hanging in the dark shouldn't mean being left in the dark. And in a world full of myths, back to the real legends, no cape required. And that's all, folks. Go forth and spread the eco love.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, Emma. That was fantastic. The can I ask? Oh, I'm sure people will be smashing those questions into the chat as we speak, and you can be pleased to hear that Chris Coburn is not that Chris Coburn. So
I just saw that comment, actually.
Can I ask? I don't know if this is too fresh a thing for you to want to comment on, but the guidelines for the construction for the wind farms that DECA has just recently released. I think
Yes.
they're their final, not their draft, but their final. Are you willing to give your personal opinion about how they rate?
Yes, this is why I don't work for anyone, because I always tend to give my personal opinion on things. They won't compel anyone to do this. So they're very suggestive that we should do it. They focus only on listed species. So for Victoria, that pretty much exclusively means southern bent-winged bats and the grey-headed flying fox. A lot of the survey effort and monitoring that we do is insufficient to detect southern bent-winged bat impacts. Whenever we have found them and we've increased our effort, we have found more. So if we find one kill, it is representative of a much more than we are finding. There are also wind farms that haven't been monitored now for 10 or 15 years that were done under poor planning. So for example, down at Portland, where we did that curtailment trial, that trial was on stage 4. There were 3 stages before that did not have the same level of scrutiny. And our trial was on Cape Nelson North. Cape Nelson South is closer to the cave where they live. So it's highly likely that you've got much higher kills there. So they've done nothing to address the current impact that's happening on our threatened species. And it does not include things like the white-striped freetail bat, where we have no data on its current population size, and therefore no information on whether the level of fatality that it's now experiencing is sustainable. I don't know any other mammal in Australia that we could kill 20 to 40,000 a year of and think it was a sustainable kill rate, especially if we didn't know the starting population. And we can do it. Fisheries have developed techniques where they can work out how many are there without counting them all and how many they can take whilst maintaining a population. So the science exists, but it hasn't been applied in this situation. So no, it's a start, but it's 20 years late start.
Yes, it sounds like a massive disappointment. I know VNPA had some slight input into that process in the first round, where it was talking about threatened ecological communities, at least, rather like or threatened. We were thought it would include grassland species, but then the brief of the project suddenly shrank to bats and brolgas, basically, and left all the things underneath the wind turbine.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's exclusively birds and bats, but it also doesn't protect things like wedge-tailed eagles, which are being killed in very high numbers as well, because they're not listed species. So it's a very poor start, but it's a start.
Okay. Right, indeed. Ewan has a question. Is there a publicly available library of bat calls that can be used to compare sonograms from bat detectors?
It is in development, I believe, for Australia. So there are some that are better than others, and there is now online software like Kaleidoscope that can help you filter through it. But primarily, anyone I know that's using it is sending it to sort of a few key people in Australia for analysis. There's not It's not a huge number of people that do it.
Mm.
But I think with technology at the moment, I think over the next 10 years, I think this is going to become so much easier for everybody.
Yeah, the bats will be very thankful for that. Indeed. Debbie Reynolds asks why we don't adopt the current best practice. What's stopping them? I suppose that goes to the like why has America got this care for legacy deal going and we haven't? Are we just greedy shitheads here or what?
Yeah, so America has a voluntary program to do it, but it has meant that about 30% of wind farms in America have some form of curtailment. Canada now has a compulsory one for 2 months of the year, and Germany is now compulsory, and they're looking at backdating it to old wind farms. But otherwise, the rest of the world is reasonably patchy. I do a lot of work now in Southeast Asia, and if you are funded by Asia Development Bank to build a wind farm, you will have compulsory curtailment in place. So it's in countries like Laos and Vietnam, we are now implementing much better practices than we are in Australia because of this sort of top-down financial pressure. In Australia, we have a lot of European companies and American companies that have been dealing with this overseas. So they know the problem is there. They know the solutions are there, but we do not have anything compelling them to do it. People are not, brokers have all this protection, but people are not noisy about bats. They don't, a lot of people don't like bats. And if nobody's making them do it, they won't do it. It's corporate greed and inaction by the government. So it comes down to the planning department more than the environment department. I know the people at ARI that have sort of put that work together are doing a fantastic job, and they understand the issues, but they are not the decision makers in this instance.
No, it's deeply disappointing. Mark Backman has a question. Do you have any opinion on the level of risk posed by the proposed Kentbrook wind farm next to the Discovery Bay Ramsar wetlands on bats, and in particular southern bentwing bats? The risk is currently being downplayed. I'm
not sure where exactly that wind farm is in Victoria.
Mark, do you want to speak up?
Yeah, it's just west of the area you were talking about. So it's the entire coastal strip between Portland and the state border with South Australia. And there's a massive 105, 300 metre tall wind farm that's currently before a hearing they're trying to put a wind farm through the pine plantations immediately adjacent to the wetlands in Long Swamp, which is in that Discovery Bay coast. So yeah, not far from where you were describing down near Portland, but to the west.
Yeah, so all of that entire area is southern bentwing bat country, and absolutely bats are attracted to turbines. So even their pre-construction risk assessments do not predict their post-construction impact. So even if they go and record the bats and they say the density of bats in this area is very low, we're not getting many calls, they'll build the turbine and density will increase. And that's been shown widely. So if I was the king, if I was building a wind farm in that area, I would have compulsory curtailment, because it is so difficult to prove an impact, but the evidence is saying that we know there is an impact. In America, for example, if they were surveying for a threatened bat species, they would be out there every day for 3 months surveying. We go out twice a month. So we'll go out on one day, we'll go back 2 days later, because the rate of removal of these bat carcasses is quite quick by foxes and magpies and the crows and things that eat them. And so we just sort of have this 2-day snapshot each month, but we're not actually seeing what's happening for the rest of that month. And, we're in Victoria. The summer can be beautiful one day and raining the next. And I can wake up, after a warm, still night, I sort of wake up in the morning sad, because I know that bats have been killed right across Western Victoria because it was warm, wind speed was somewhere around 3 or 4 meters per second. And if that's not one of those 2 or 3 days that we're surveying, we're not capturing it at all. So yes, there will be southern bentwing bat impacts. And if anyone says there won't be, they have false information.
Okay, that's great to know. Can you just follow on from that? Why do turbines attract bats?
We don't know. There's been lots of research. There is evidence that some bats do avoid them, but overwhelmingly more bats are attracted to them. And it may be that there's some kind of insect relationship happening, but watch this space. There's heaps of people working on this, and there's no definitive answer at the moment at all.
Okay. Sasaski has got a possibly silly question, which is, do bats fly over the ocean?
Yes.
Offshore turbines likely to cause impacts.
The turbines that we're looking at putting offshore, I think we're quite a distance, so like 10 kilometers offshore, and you will absolutely see a drop off. So bats can fly offshore, but there's no reason for them to go that way. I'm still thinking that we have some migration happening between Tasmania and Australia with our bats mainland, and they will be monitoring that, because obviously you've got birds that fly across there that will get much more attention because they're birds. And by default, the bats will be investigated too. But yes, if the turbines are significantly far offshore, the impact to bats will be much lower than what it would be closer to the shore.
Right. Are there implications? Sorry, I'll ask this while I'm still looking. Are there implications for like paddock trees and that sort of thing? Are these sort of elements in our landscape we should be trying to retain? Like how should we, is there a particular way we should be looking after our grassy plains, as it were, our savanna landscape perhaps, that is perhaps more bat friendly, that we haven't particularly been good at?
Well, absolutely. These isolated paddock trees are just critical bat habitat. So you can just have a small number of trees, and they can live in groups like the white striped freetail in groups of 50 or 100. And so they only need one tree for that. And they might, have a few trees scattered across the landscape that are spatially separated, but they will be critical habitat. And we want to keep our bats. So they're not, if there's no trees at all, if it's just broadacre grassland with no trees at all, you're not getting somewhere for them to sleep during the day. So absolutely, paddock trees. You can build bat boxes. We have a bit of an issue in Australia where in Victoria, where one species loves a bat box and the other species tend not to. So we sort of increase our most abundant bat, maybe to the detriment of some of the others. So I think, bat boxes in cities and towns are very good. I'm not sure about the grassy plains. I would be preferring to see those old paddock trees retained and maintained. And a succession plan, because they won't be there forever. Yes,
indeed. And all right, so here's a long question from David Unwin, and a funny one. Because he's a bat ginner, and he doesn't really know much about bats, but he does have an interest in mistletoes. By removing mistletoe, evidence suggesting removing mistletoes results in 30% reduction in bird populations. Is there a similar impact to bats? Bats mistletoe lovers, or the fruitivorous ones, or what else?
I actually don't know the answer to that. Sorry, David. I would suggest that potentially flying foxes might be into the mistletoes, but apart from the mistletoe bird, which I know eats them and spreads them around, I'm not familiar with them. But that balance of, it was like, I think in his question, I was just having a look, there's that sort of some evidence that results in reduction in bird populations. If mistletoe is important for insects, then it's important for bats. So,
indeed. All right. The mysteries of mistletoe. It is one of the less researched areas of our landscape.
I think you can get a full diet analysis of a grey-headed flying fox. It is online somewhere. And I think there's about 80 species across Australia that they feed on. And that includes some of the fruits from our back garden. So, you know, figs and things like that are very popular for them. But yeah, I'm not sure if mistletoe is in there, but that information for flying fox is available, but I'm not sure if it's available for any of the other species.
I wanted to ask too about bat density. Like, how many bats, like if in a square, I don't know, say some good quality, I don't know how to phrase this question properly, but you know, in a relatively natural area with are there like 1,000 bats per square kilometre or hectare or metre?
Look, I don't know, but it's a lot more than you think it is. So they're the most, apart from mice,
Yes.
or rodents, they're the most abundant mammal on Earth. So if you sort of think about that in context, you know, there is, I think the largest bat cave has 15 million bats in it. So that's in Texas. And that's an insectivorous bat. So they all fly out, all 15 million at the same time, and they all fly back in the morning. So, and then you see in the Philippines, you've got a rosettus, which is a nectar feeding bat, and there is about 3 or 4 million of them in a cave that fly out every night or every morning and come back at night. So we can see, like, just if depending on where you're standing, if you're standing near that bat cave in Texas, you've got 15 million in a very small space.
That's true.
And so I think it does depend on that habitat. I said there's about 13 species of bats in Victoria, and there's probably about 8 of them that are really common. And for example, you know, we could turn up on a day in March to survey 50 turbines and find, you know, 20 or 30 dead bats that day. So that's what's just sort of flown through recently. And estimates is that some of these sites are sort of killing, you know, 500 to 1,000 bats a year, scattered right across Western Victoria, adding up to that 20 to 40,000 bats that are dying. So I'd like to think there are millions, because if there's not, then we're heading towards an extinction event.
Indeed. Jessie Clune, with some bats living up to 40 years old, do they go through menopause?
I don't know. That the evidence is that the oldest bats that they've measured are still breeding. So they know that they've measured sort of 22 to 30-year-old bats, female bats that are still fertile. So they haven't found that post-fertility yet. So maybe not. That'd be terrible. Gotta stop breeding.
Michael Robinson asks, aside from caves, where do most bats sleep?
Bark in trees, in bridges, in people's roofs and houses. So a little tiny crack. There was someone in Queensland had one of those beach umbrella, like big umbrellas that you put up in summer over your outdoor dining table, and went to put it up and found a colony of about 50 bats, and so was unable to put their umbrella up. They let them go through the winter and then put it up during the night when they weren't there, so that they wouldn't come back. But they will find any little nook and cranny and do it. But yeah, naturally, before we came and brought all these artificial structures, it was just a tiny little fissure in the bark of a tree, and you'll find bats in there. They're really hard to find during the day when we know they're sleeping.
Right. John Del Pratt, you have your hand up.
Emma, there was mentions of dogs earlier in the presentation, or Adrian introduced you with talking about dogs. Is this part of the bat story?
Yes, so Elmoby Ecology, Elmo and Moby were my first dogs 20 years ago, and Elmo was Australia's first bat detection dog. So she was, and bird detection, so she was trained to survey bird and bats at wind farms. Originally, she was just trained on birds because we didn't know bats were impacted. But because I'd trained her as a generalist search dog, she started finding bats. And so now we have probably in Australia about 10 or 12 dogs at least, probably more now actually, that are specifically trained to survey for birds and bats at wind farms. And when we're looking at tiny little bats that are really small or parts thereof, so they might just be a wing fragment left or a foot in some cases. I've seen very small things that dogs have found. And so dogs are particularly useful when we're finding those small, really hard to see critters. So I've just finished my PhD on how we evaluate detection dogs when they're looking for rare species. And dogs are doing all sorts of things. I think if you're talking about grassy plains, they're looking for your little lizards. I think Zoos Victoria have got detection dogs there that they're training on, and they're working in the grassy plains. So they're another useful sort of tool in the kit to be used. Don't like that word because dogs aren't a tool, but they are very useful at finding things that we can't see very well.
And I just follow that up with: are they generalist detection, or are they trained specifically for the species, or is it a very general training?
It depends on what the target is. So
I meant for bats, in fact, in this case.
Yeah. So if we're talking about the wind farm dogs, they're generalists to find all birds and bats. And in some cases, they are sort of generalist cadaver dogs in a way. So they will show you if there's a dead rodent or things. It depends on sort of how broad your training is, but you can train them to be very specific as well. So in the case of the dogs we use for wind farms, they're very generalist because we want them to show us anything dead under a turbine effectively, just in case we get surprises like we did sort of 18 years ago when we started finding bats. But for something like the legless lizard, that dog will be specifically trained to just find that species and ignore all the others.
Thank you.
Mark is back with another question. Is anyone working on a method to determine population sizes for species? Because the rates might be more important than we think.
So anything that's listed under the EPBC Act, so we know the population of southern bentwings, we know grey-headed flying foxes, we know spectacled foxes, we know the ghost bat, we know the pilbara leaf-nosed bat, which is probably one of the most studied bats in Australia because Hammersley, Rio Tinto and BHP and all that are paying for that studies. But no, all of these common species, we've got some funding proposals in at the moment because there's new genetic technology which will enable population estimates. So if we have a sample of sort of 100 bats and we from across the east coast of Australia and we take their DNA, we could determine a relative breeding population size, so the number of breeding females, and by default double it and call it a population size. So that's our best sort of avenue at the moment. But no, these bats that are dying in these large numbers, we do not know, and there is no government or industry-led project to determine the numbers. There's just detection dog handlers and concerned ecologists trying to get funding to find it out.
Bad government. Okay. And what percentage of carcasses do you think are scavenged and eaten before you find them?
There's a lot. So we do trials on this. We place out dead birds and bats and we monitor their removal times. So in Victoria, a bat persists somewhere between 1 and 3 days. So doesn't mean they're all gone after 3 days. That means half of them are gone after 3 days. So we have a mean persistence of somewhere around about 2.2, I think it is, on average across the state. It can be higher in some places and lower in others. But it does mean that, if we're only surveying once a month with a slight follow-up, you're missing a lot. That's a pretty high removal rate.
Yeah, certainly is. And perhaps one last question. Are you monitoring any sites where wind farms are close to large wetlands? And does proximity to water which increases insect abundance, increase rates of collision?
Yes, there's plenty of wind farms that are near large bodies of water. Think about Lake Goldsmith is surrounded by turbines now. There's quite a lot of water bodies. Usually they're monitored more intensely because there is that sort of preconceived idea that it might have a higher impact, but not necessarily. The one that, the wind farm that's having the highest impact that I know of is not near any large bodies of water, and I couldn't even tell you the reasons why it is. I will say Alan Ford's been waving a lot and trying to get your attention.
So I'm sorry, Alan.
Emma, I live in an urban area, but there may be highways around me. What would be a useful recording device?
You can get bat recording devices on your phone now, which will record the sounds of bats, because you will still have bats in the city. And because we're talking about a specific frequency range that we're looking in, it does exclude a lot of those deeper sounds. So you can record bat acoustics in the city quite well. There are specific, there's 2 brands of specific acoustic recorders designed for bats. They're a bit like the bird ones with a microphone and record at a particular frequency. But if it as a hobby, I would suggest downloading the Bat app. I'm sorry, I haven't got it. I can't think of what it is right now, but there is an app now that'll allow you to record bats. It won't identify them to species, but it will highlight the bats and when they're flying past for you. And if you can hear them, or, it'll be the white striped freetails, which you still see in the city as well.
Indeed. I've heard them in Burke Street in the middle of Melbourne. It's that distinctive noise, like coins clicking against each other or something.
Yeah.
Well, unless anyone else has got any more pressing questions, let's let Dr. Emma be on her way. Thank you very much. That's been fascinating as always, and very, very, very informative, and we will all be much more bat aware now, and we will certainly be putting in our submissions talking about curtailment.
Absolutely.
Yes, indeed.
Please do.
Yes, indeed.